Here at OSU. We are a registered student organization here on campus, which joins over 50 campus chapters across the US, Europe, Asia, Oceania. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December of 2006, organizes public reading groups for research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. So the club here at OSU hosts a weekly meetup on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. at Java 2 Cafe, the one at the Valley Library, and a weekly reading group on the history of the left starting at 6 p.m. on Wednesdays, which I think is on that side of Stag, that's in Stag 111, I think. I'm not sure. But if you're interested, please add your name to the sign-up sheet or join the club at Ideologic on Oregon State. Give this thing. We have a free monthly broadsheet featuring widely divergent perspectives on the left, the Platypus Review, which is available around campus, and also there's a bunch of them right there. We can't give them away quick enough, so feel free to take any. And with that, I'll turn things over to our moderator for the day, which is Matthew Calhoun.
Hello. Let me introduce our panelists. We have from left to right, we have Randy Taylor, who has been organizing on the left since 2018. They are currently a member of the Industrial Workers of the World and the Coalition of Graduate Employees, and are working on building a radical council for local high-level political strategy. In the past, they have done work with the Democratic Socialist Caucus and North Philadelphia Food Not Bombs, and helped organize the Heart of the Valley Anti-Capitalist Book Fair. Randy was previously a panelist at one of our club's panels that we hosted in October 2022, titled The Politics of Work, which you can view on YouTube. Rajiv is a PhD candidate in media studies at the University of Oregon. He is a member of the Graduate Teaching Fellows Federation, AFT Local 3544, and previously served as VP for External Relations and President of the Union. Prior to graduate school, Rajiv worked as an editor for Gamal, South Asian, and Jacobin magazines, and has published articles in a variety of US and international media outlets. Christian Williams is the author of 6 books, including his most recent book, Gang Politics, which you can purchase over there. He was interviewed for the Platypus Review in March 2021 on his AK Press piece titled Wither Anarchism. Williams has actively been writing and leading discourse on anarchism in historical and present-day contexts, social inequities, and critiques on police and political force since the 1990s. He lives in Portland, Oregon. And joining us remotely is Douglas Lane. Douglas is the author of the novel Bash Bash Revolution, the former publishing manager for the critical theory imprint Zero Books, the head of Civilization Media, and the creator of hundreds of videos on critical theory, including The Russiagate's Hoax Proves the Deep State Runs Society, How Woke Ideology is Replacing Individual Liberty, and he is the podcaster behind the Diet Soap podcast. He took part in the previous panels we hosted titled What is Socialism, held in 2018. The guidelines for this particular panel are that panelists have a maximum of 12 minutes for their initial remarks. And when John here lets them know that the timer goes off, we will ask them to wrap up their remarks, but hope they will be able to expand their thoughts during the Q&A period. After that, there will be a 3-minute block for each person. We have asked them to use this time to help clarify differences and similarities among their remarks. We hope that this will set the stage for a lively, respectful, and focused Q&A with you. I will wind things down at 7:45 and allow the panelists to make some concluding remarks. Afterwards, we plan to keep the conversation going at Minimums on Monroe. Let me read out the prompt they were given. It begins with a quote from the founder of Jacobin magazine, Bhaskar Sankara, and a piece he wrote titled Phase 2, which appeared in the immediate wake of the Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring events of 2010. Movements can get politicized. No movement emerges out of an apolitical era and latches immediately onto some sort of unified and comprehensive critique. A new politics will emerge in part from the cauldron of occupation. But real debates, the clash of ideas beyond just rosy, impressionistic reports from the front, are required now more than ever. With this quote in mind, we ask the panelists to respond to the following prompt. Since 2020, the left has undergone a transformation in organizing and self-conception. With the end of the Bernie Sanders movement, the lifting of COVID restrictions, and political disorientation under the Biden administration, horizons for the contemporary left has shifted to street politics, taking up popular discontents with racism, climate change, and American foreign policy. This recalls images of the past, not only of the late 60s and 70s, but the early moments of the Millennial Left, born out of Occupy, the anti-war movement, and the shadow of anarchism in the 80s and 90s. How should today's left consider this history, and what resonance does it have, if any, with the current moment? How have the politics of protest been impacted by the Biden administration and the looming specter of Trump? And are horizons of possibility for the left today greater than they were 10 years ago? All right, with that, perhaps we should begin with Ren.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm glad I get to go first. I'm intimidated about living up to the rest of the panel.
Good.
So, protest serves many roles, but rarely is it the cauldron out of which new politics emerge. Rather, it is where established politics find new life. So, among my many roles in life, I am a dancer. And the common advice you hear as a dancer is always this: in the studio, give all of your focus, analyze every detail of your motion, critique, strive for perfection. When you perform, don't think, just dance. So I think of protest as being to the left what a performance is to the dancer. In our permanent organizations, we should analyze, we should experiment, we should practice new forms of democracy, we should form new politics. During a protest, don't think, just be present with the people there. Protest is a time to share what you have already developed with others, both those new to the left and those experienced with organizing. For the former group, protest can serve as a means of political education. We often hear that in times of crisis, people turn to figures of authority for solutions. Occasionally, I believe we are lucky and people turn to the natural authority of people who have thought about an issue for a bit longer than they have. Protests are one way in which people express their instantaneous moral reaction to events. I lost my slide. So, and for this reason, I do not believe protests need fixed demands. The moral reaction precedes and supersedes any analysis. The author Ursula K. Le Guin wrote in her piece, Living in a Work of Art, quote, "I have trouble distinguishing the ethical from the aesthetic. Both my ethical and my aesthetic responses tend to be immediate to the point of suddenness, hesitant only in cases of real novelty and complexity, and stubborn." When crises occur and people make these types of immediate ethical decisions, we should be ready for those people to turn to us. I remember after the New Zealand Christchurch shootings, when I was in college at the University of Pennsylvania, a new member appeared at our Penn Socialist meetings. When we asked why he wanted to join, he said he simply, quote, couldn't keep doing nothing. He had no particular strategy he wanted to pursue. He only wanted to join together with people who were opposing the way things were. At protests, people like this meet people who are engaged with radical organizations. They hear speeches that expose them to new ideas. They become political. However, our organizations need to be ready. A major failure of the left recently was its inability to respond to the popular uprisings that followed the killing of George Floyd in 2020. During this time, police abolition became a common sentiment in the United States. A Gallup survey conducted that July showed that well over half of US citizens believed policing needed an overhaul, and 1/3 of young people in the US believed that it needed to be abolished. However, there simply weren't enough organizations doing police and prison abolition, and those that existed were not effective enough to gain support of the masses. In the end, support fizzled out. People went back to supporting the police state and continue to support Joe Biden despite his intentions to increase militarized policing nationwide. Compare this with the COVID-19 pandemic, which the left was much better prepared for. When the virus reached the United States in early 2020 and local and state governments began implementing lockdowns, I remember feeling extremely low. Not only was I worried about the millions of lives that were going to be lost, I was also depressed about its prospects for the left. How are we going to continue free meal programs when people were hoarding groceries? How are we going to respond to a crisis where people were likely to turn to the state and to fascism for solutions? Every organization I was in was panicking. But in the end, the outcome astonished me, particularly the public consciousness around mutual aid. Friends I hadn't spoken to since high school were messaging me to direct me to mutual aid projects. When all of the restaurants in my city shut down, they sent their supplies to Food Not Bombs and other anarchist mutual aid organizations. In this case, the libertarian left had been handling resource distribution for a long time, and they were ready when the crisis came. Organized labor, likewise, was ready for those who walked off their jobs when they realized their employers cared more about their labor than about their lives. Since 2020, we've seen a sharp rise in union drives and union elections, and even renewed calls for a general strike. These are the shifts we see in society when the left positions itself well. Protest also serves as a form of communication between organizations. After the January 2020 assassination of Iranian General Soleimani, I attended an anti-war protest on the streets of Philadelphia that was overwhelmingly attended by people with left-wing politics. At the protest, we marched and we chanted, but most of all, we distributed literature and we asked each other, what do you think we should do? At the time, it seemed like we were at the beginning of a long anti-war movement, and we were trying to define its strategy as best as we could. In this case, protest was foremost a means of communication. It was an excuse to get like-minded people in the same place talking about the same subject. The relationships being forged between the people in attendance were more important to us than the perceptions of those who were only witnessing the demonstration. I've sort of danced around the question of the panel here because I think it's trying to draw a distinction between quote unquote street politics and quote unquote true politics that I do not believe exists. I don't think we need a mass leftist party that performs politics that are separate from the dynamic I've described. Rather, I think we need a wide breadth of specialized organizations that are striving constantly towards the change they want to see in the world. And we need a large number of educated comrades who can bring people into the fold between the time when they are ready to act and the time when they form their own complete theory of change. I do not believe any time is more favorable or less favorable to the left. Instead, I think that leftists have not always been organized in a way that is favorable to their times. If we're ready when the next crisis comes, change will happen. If we're not ready, consider who will be. Thank you.
Again, thank you for the invitation. It's a challenging prompt, so I try to work through it. I'm looking forward to the discussion. In approaching this conversation, I sort of felt that it's important to take stock of where we are as the left, why we're in this predicament, and what we're up against. In terms of the last part, let's sort of start with that last part, what we're up against. The situation is daunting. We're facing a resurgent right-wing movement across the country and around the world, from Argentina to India to Italy. Here in the US, the right has a comprehensive vision of what it intends to do in power. The Heritage Foundation Plan 2025, a collaboration with 100 other right-wing organizations, outlines the project of replacing federal workers with right-wing ideologues, slashing environmental and climate regulations, eliminating the education department, and empowering military and law enforcement to go after political adversaries, among other things that they think would help to dismantle the so-called deep state. And this is all along the lines of what former Trump advisor Steve Bannon talked about in terms of gutting and remaking the administrative state. Closer to our immediate sphere, the university setting, Turning Point USA has developed the Campus Victory Project, a well-funded initiative to capture student government positions with the goal of cutting funding to progressive organizations. We saw a set of candidates who are now in power at the University of Oregon who met each other at a conference funded by the Campus Victory Project. These plans to remake institutions are paired with right-wing street and community mobilization efforts and a real threat of violence related to this, heading into this year's election. We've also seen during this period, since the pandemic started and certainly before that, but soaring profits and further concentration of wealth in the top 1%, which recently achieved a record wealth of 44 trillion, seen the rise of finance capital. We've also seen tech companies increasing their grip on our day-to-day lives, monetizing each action and utterance that we have on social media and leeching off of content generated by journalists and generated elsewhere. And we've also seen corporate attempts to severely curtail the right to strike and the enforcement capacity of the National Labor Relations Board, which has been active in supporting new organizing drives. So I think there's a difficult question for us on the left as to why the right, looking at Tea Party and other recent formations, how have they been able to move more quickly in making their influence felt? How have they seized upon, it seems that they've seized upon the discontent with the neoliberal regime more effectively than we have. And one possibility is simply, just as a function of having more financial institutional backing on the right, also coupled with the reality that the left consists of many disparate elements that haven't cohered around a common program. So there's a need to seriously consider the current situation and set of conditions because of the tendency to misdirect our efforts and to direct our energies towards battles that may have importance, but are ultimately inadequate in dealing with the enormity of the crises we face and the level of control exerted on us. We encounter many of these efforts, especially on campuses, and people who consider themselves to be radicals and against the existing order and social relations. But when you look at their political engagement, is profoundly individual and focused almost entirely on discourse and representation, all of which is compatible with neoliberal capitalism. Along these lines, there's a distinct tendency to foreground and center a centralized identity as a primary mode of engagement. As the prompt for this panel suggests, we've had some dynamic movements come to the fore, from the anti-war movement to Occupy to Black Lives Matter. When these movements dissipate, they don't disappear. They get funneled into new initiatives with people having been informed by their experiences, having been part of these movements. At the same time, we should recognize the limits of building street movements when we lack a durable organizational apparatus to be able to win actual material gains, which is what the Socialist Project is about. Energy, that we've seen in movements that have come up have unfortunately been co-opted through electoralism. I can think of Occupy, there's an Occupy that went from Occupy Wall Street to Occupy the Vote. Or we saw institutional capture, especially, in relation to Black Lives Matter, where there are so many DEI initiatives that were, incorporated at universities or even by the CIA, which has this ridiculous advertisement, sort of promotional video talking about the diversity, how diversity, equity, and inclusion is important in recruiting new CIA agents. Popular mobilizations have articulated a wide range of demands that are at times compelling and galvanizing. You can all think of, and we still are galvanized by, we are the 99%. But at the same time, the demands and the claims that are made can seem aimless. At this juncture, capital is running amok and in control of our lives beyond what we can fully grasp at a given moment. And, sometimes what we see in response is calling things as emancipatory, but those things are actually amenable to the status quo and the existing set of social and economic relations. So we have this dynamic too of sometimes we have calls for, we talk about revolutionary politics, especially on the left. We want to revitalize revolutionary politics. We talk about calls for general strike. We have no apparatus to bring those things to fruition at this point because we haven't done the organizing to actually realize those really laudable aims and things that I think a lot of us would want to see and that we have seen in this country, but we don't have the apparatus to do that. We're very far from what existed in the past. If you go back to the 1919 Seattle general strike or any instance where we've had a general strike, compare what our organizing capacity is at this point, or organizational capacity is at this point versus what they had then, it's a difficult comparison because I don't think we are where we need to be able to move in that direction. We desperately need to grapple with how the capitalist system functions, how corporations are maneuvering across borders, and how supply chains are organized so that we can identify where we can exert pressure and where we have leverage. We have to look to the past to understand what was on the table and what level of mobilizations took place and what the vision was for working class emancipation that was being put forward by groups, by incredible labor organizations like the Knights of Labor, by the Industrial Workers of the World, which are, especially heading into May Day, these are the types of groups that we should be amplifying the history around. These are labor traditions that mobilized hundreds of thousands of people over 100 years ago to fight for an 8-hour workday, for better wages, for safer working conditions, the end of child labor. They also had a vision for transforming the economic and political system. You had the Knights of Labor talking about a cooperative commonwealth, abolishing the wage system. And you had the IWW talking about organizing industrially across workplaces and sectors. So at this point, kind of getting to the last question of the prompt about sort of, are we in a better place or how are we at this point in relation to 10 years ago? I mean, it's such a crucial time right now to continue the project of reconnecting the left to the labor movement, connecting more broadly to working class life and institutions and revitalizing working class institutions. I think these are all things that socialists need to take up. And part of the rise of the right relates to organizations like unions disappearing from communities, especially in the period of deindustrialization and free trade deals, that there are spaces that were left absent. And you saw a shift in politics because there's no mobilization by any left-wing force, there's no unions there. And you saw a shift in the way people were being politicized, and the right took advantage of that. So a union is not just an avenue, union politics is not just an avenue to advocate on the job in a limited sense, but it's also a social organization that forces workers to engage with one another around shared interests and also has the potential to politicize them along class lines. So we have real possibilities ahead of us, and many of us in the labor movement are truly hopeful. I'm just coming off of a Labor Notes conference, which brought together 4,500 unionists across the country. An additional 1,500 people wanted to join, but there wasn't capacity for it. And what you saw there, and what really resonated, is these labor realignments and the revitalization of radical left organizing within unions and reform movements within unions like the United Auto Workers that have led to major gains for workers and have put class struggle back on the table and have put major material gains back on the table for all of us and have revitalized socialist movement back on the table. We're seeing how the strike, is being recognized again as the most effective weapon of the working class, which we saw with the UAW strike and the near Teamsters strike. And it's sort of all part of a long project of, on a longer time horizon of building back a base that we had, a working class base that we had, and part of that building of the base is having unions at the center, just given the centrality of work and how that's resonated with many younger folks, especially in workplaces like Starbucks and even for the University of Oregon student workers. Just 3,000 new unionists who won their union drive and now are affiliated with UAW. There's a promise of red and green politics, traditional left and environmental politics coming together, shaped by unions. We see unions taking up the environmental crisis, including United Auto Workers calling for directing investments in green energy toward union workers, and GM electric vehicle battery plants coming under their contract. And all of this was made possible by reform movements and movements, sort of people on the left who are active in unions to sort of shape or shift the way unions are working. And I'll just end with this. I want to draw on Albert and Lucy Parsons, who are, especially heading into May Day, really prominent people, from that history of the Haymarket struggle. And Albert Parsons was one of the people executed as a Haymarket martyr, who viewed a union as being at the center of revolutionary politics. They had this thing called the Chicago idea. And, they said, for the Midwesterners, the union was more than a vehicle of class struggle. It was an autonomous commune in the process of incubation, the embryonic group of the future of a free society. And I really think that we have a possibility to recapture that. And what we're seeing is this reintegration of the left with the labor movement can revitalize socialist politics that I think all of us should support, but also become part of in whatever way they can. Look forward to your question. Thank you.
I'm going to go after the question a little obliquely because there's a lot to that prompt. We're going to start by talking about recent past and then the immediate future that we're facing. And in particular, I'm going to talk about the experience in Portland, Oregon, partly because I'm familiar with it. I live there. Partly because I think that it is something of a harbinger of what the rest of you will be facing. In 2020, during the George Floyd uprising, Portland had more than 100 days of protests in a row, many of which shaded over into actual combat. I'm not being hyperbolic about that. The police reported 6,000 uses of force, which is universally understood to be an undercount. Much of that at lethal levels. Like, it's really just a matter of luck that they did not kill anyone. On the other hand, protesters were engaged in arson, looting, and fought the cops with clubs, slingshots, and small explosives. The police reported hundreds of injuries, which ordinarily I always assumed that they're mostly talking about friendly fire problems and back injuries and things like that. But in this case, like broken bones, concussions, like actual harm resulting from the actions of protesters. We have no way of knowing how many protesters or bystanders were injured, but the city of Portland has so far paid about $3 million in lawsuits, which gives some indication of the scale. Now, all of this fighting produced immediate wins. The budget of the Portland Police Bureau was cut by $15 million. The gang squad was dissolved. The police were removed from public transit and public schools. They accelerated the program to create a non-police first responder unit modeled on the cahoots over at Eugene. In November, voters overwhelmingly passed a measure to create a review board with both investigatory and disciplinary powers, which had been a demand for about 40 years. And then statewide, voters elected to decriminalize drugs. Now, in the 4 years since, all of those gains have been reversed. The Portland police budget was increased by $50 million, making it the largest budget ever. There is now not one, but two gang squads. Police have been put back into schools, back onto public transit. The Portland street response is being actively sabotaged by its own leadership. The review board is being undermined before it can even begin its work, and drugs have been recriminalized. So what we see is the protests could win games, but they couldn't consolidate. There wasn't any organization with the power to consolidate them and preserve them. There wasn't a way to defend them when the backlash came. And it's tempting to look at this and think that that was the once-in-a-generation opportunity for revolution, and we blew it. But actually, I think it's a small taste of what the next several years are going to look like. To understand why I think that, it helps to think why that happened in Portland and why it happened in 2020. The second is easier. Police in the United States kill about 1,000 people a year. It doesn't usually result in an international crisis of conscience and a radical change in the way people are relating to the institution. So why did George Floyd produce that? And I think the obvious answer is because it happened in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic was extremely destabilizing, both for individuals and for society. The widespread social anxiety, widespread unemployment, and an abrupt change in the way people were thinking about things like work and rent and the way we relate to each other and inequality and how we get our needs met, and also a very severe distrust of institutions. So all of that just set the stage for something like a precipitating event like the George Floyd murder to create the outcome they had. It didn't have to be that particular thing. It just happened to be the thing. George Floyd just happened to be the thing that set it off. Why Portland? Well, trust in the police there was already very low. It had been consistently under attack for solidly for a decade and intermittently for 30 years before that, for which I'd like to take some credit. There had also been there was already a feeling of disappointment in the project of reform, dating back about 10 years when the Justice Department put the Portland Police under federal monitoring. But most importantly, there was the recent experience of regular street fighting. Starting in 2017, going through about 2020, right-wing gangs like Patriot Prayer and Proud Boys regularly convened into the city, provoked violence, and one thing that did was it sort of normalized the idea of fighting about politics. It also made it very clear to everyone who was paying attention that the police were not sort of neutral referees in this contest, that they were partisans. And all of that meant that when the George Floyd uprising occurred, there were people who had actual experience with fighting and a lot more people who were kind of used to the idea. Now, I don't think that what this suggests is that we are waiting for the next pandemic. And I don't think it will necessarily, the next crisis will not necessarily be the same as the last crisis. But climate change alone would be enough to ensure that we're going to see increasing crises for the foreseeable future. And not just in terms of how it changes the weather, but also in terms of what that means for food, what that means for water, what that means for supply chains, what's going to happen when large populations are displaced. And all of those are going to have their own social effects. And a lot of those are going to produce crises on the road. So there'll be a cascading effect of this. Secondly, I think we need to expect more immediately an increase in political violence, especially leading up to and then after the election. In 2016, Donald Trump won. And then what that did was that emboldened the far right, led to that period of street fighting that I just described. In 2020, Donald Trump lost, which led to January 6th and everything that led up to that. Again, whatever happens I should also say that this has already occurred, that it's in different form, but across the country, election workers are resigning in record numbers. The thing that they cite most is intimidation and harassment, that they are being targeted in ways that make it impossible or unpleasant for them to do their jobs. And we should expect that that will also escalate as we get closer to the election. Now, I don't think that the next period will necessarily look exactly like the last period, partly because what characterized 2017 to 2020 is that right-wing thugs from all over the country converged on places like Portland and Berkeley and Charlottesville, but Portland over and over again, and tightened up their organization, worked out their tactics, got some experience doing that. In the period since 2020, they've mostly been doing those same things on a smaller scale and more locally. So I think while we need to expect an increase in violence, it won't necessarily be concentrated in a single place as it was during the Trump years. It will be more dispersed in smaller locations throughout the country, because that's how they've been organizing since then. Now, what that suggests for the left moving forward is that I think it highlights the need to take what's called a three-way fight perspective, this being a term popularized by Matthew Lyons, but I don't know if he coined the term. And the idea is that political conflict isn't just a matter of left versus right. It's a matter of a radical left, a radical right, and the neoliberal status quo. And that each of these three elements are in conflict with the other two. Now, I think this perspective is important because it helps us to avoid some common mistakes. One is it helps us avoid thinking that the enemy of our enemies is our friend. Just because the Proud Boys also want to overturn the neoliberal status quo doesn't mean that the future that they envision is anything like the future that we envision. Similarly, just because the FBI is moving against the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th doesn't mean that they have our best interests in heart. The second mistake it helps us to avoid is thinking that all of our enemies are the same. It should be increasingly clear at this point that neoliberalism and fascism aren't the same thing, and we need to take different approaches to countering each of them. But most of all, what it shows is that we need to counter each of them. That the left it can't simply defend the status quo, even when the status quo is being attacked by fascists. We also need to organize autonomously of, for example, the Democratic Party, or my union. And we need to be ready to present a radical vision that is different, that is notably different than either what the Democrats are selling or what the far right is offering. And we need to be able to confront them not only at the level of street fights, but at the level of ideas. And we need to be able to sell our vision and organize people toward that. Because we can win tactically all day, but if we lose the popular support, then we lose.
Thank you.
All right. Shall I go now?
Oh, what do we? Yeah, no.
Okay. So I'm going to risk appearing paranoid with my answer to these prompts. I want to start by noting that while the left of the 60s and 70s emerged from a milieu that was already compromised by its integration into the progressive populist state, it also emerged at a moment when socialist movements still had some slight connection to a struggle that extended back to 1848. So, for instance, the sectarian group I once belonged to really got its start at the beginning of the New Left moment, and it could trace its history back to a split within the Fourth International. The Forrest Johnson tendency, facing reality, news and letters, these are all the same thing, and they were attempts to realize socialism from within Trotskyism. I think the New Left was attempting to work within a socialist tradition overall. However, after the death of the Millennial Left, I suspect that we would be better off understanding today's pro-Palestinian protests as emerging out of a split from within the Democratic Party, rather than as emerging out of socialism or the socialist tradition. It's worth considering what critics of the pro-Palestinian protest say about them. Specifically, the magazine Tablet runs a Substack that I subscribe to, and today they ran an article explaining that the National Students for Justice in Palestine, the organization that called for the recent spate of campus protests that are dominating everyone's Twitter feeds, is funded by WESPAC. That's the Westchester Peace and Justice or something or other. It's a foundation with includes on the board of directors a former program manager from the New York Times, and a man who ran as a Democrat against Jamal Bowman in New York. The pro-Zionist critics at Tablet go on in their essay to suggest that Antifa is influencing the protests, and to note that Antifa is supported by Maoists and Maoist organizations such as Refuse Fascism, a group funded by the Alliance for Global Justice, which they say is supported by the Tides Foundation. The Tides Foundation is a dark money group working for the Democratic Party. Or as Bing's AI put it, it has been described as a dark money group due to its method of funding, which can make it difficult to trace the original sources of donations. The Tides Foundation helps to ensure that Democratic voters turn out during elections. It also runs the Healthy Democracy Fund. The Healthy Democracy Fund began in 2017, the same year that the Department of Homeland Security announced that all communications infrastructure in the United States would fall under its jurisdiction from henceforth, and that the Department of Homeland Security would also prioritize combating disinformation in reaction to the Russian influence efforts that happened during the 2016 election. The Healthy Democracy Fund is part of the whole society effort to combat disinformation, the effort that the Department of Homeland Security announced was needed after Trump. The story I'm telling is one wherein the administrative state is both funding the pro-Palestinian protests and funding efforts to label pro-Palestinian protesters as disinformation agents. The Democratic Party and its allies in the deep state have ended up operating in contradiction, which is not really that unusual. I don't know if any of you remember the old Woody Allen movie entitled Bananas, but in that movie, a fictional Latin American country is swept up in a revolution, and Woody Allen, a tourist in the country, accidentally becomes the country's new dictator. Anyhow, there's a scene in Bananas where U.S. soldiers are flown in to give support during the revolutionary struggle. One of the soldiers asks, "Are we fighting for the rebels or for the government?" The answer comes back, "The CIA isn't taking any chances this time. Some of us are going to fight for the government, and some of us are going to support the rebels." To clarify further, the U.S. state has its fingers in all the pies. It funds Israel and Hamas and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Egypt and so on and so on. Likewise, the government is funding domestic protesters and the police. It funds the ADL through the Tides Foundation. It funds the ADL and then through the Tides Foundation, the Jewish Voice for Peace. In the 70s, Maoist groups were infiltrated by the FBI. Today, the FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and many other agencies within the state bureaucracy have been infiltrated by former Maoists. And they are doing as good a job running the deep state as J. Edgar Hoover did when Woody Allen made the film Bananas. All this is to say that the student left should recognize how the organizations that are being called upon to join are not independent from capitalist progressive state politics, but are instead the products of that state. They should also recognize that while this predicament is not exactly new, this level of integration of the state with civil society, the erasure of the division between state institutions like the Department of Homeland Security and private or civil institutions like, for instance, the New York Times, is new. One of the tasks that the current left is faced with today is to fully understand the degree to which the mostly quiet war on disinformation operates and what consequence it has for us as we attempt to express dissent and organize against the state. The presenters of this panel asked me, how have the politics of protest been impacted by the Biden administration and the looming specter of Trump? The election and continued specter of Trump were used to justify the expansion of bureaucratic or deep state power. Specifically, the Clinton campaign's October surprise, the way Clinton gained support from the FBI as she attacked Trump as a Russian Manchurian candidate, had lasting consequences to the left, as many, if not most, embraced the Clinton campaign's lie. Even after the Durham report established that the claim of collusion was state propaganda, most either ignored this or refused to understand the significance of the information. What has been called Trump derangement syndrome did not only stop the left from effectively organizing during the Trump years, but helped to change the culture of the left so that rather than understanding itself as drawing its power and justification from the grassroots, from everyday people who desired to defend themselves against the state, they saw themselves as aligned with the FBI and other state agencies. This was popular front politics taken to the extreme. The Department of Homeland Security was deemed to be the most progressive force in society, and the masses were taken to represent a fascist threat. I would also remind everyone of how the state uses protests for their own purposes. Recently, the files from the Transition Integrity Project, this was a Democratic Party wargaming exercise, were leaked, and in the exercise, they worked through what the party would do if Trump won in 2020 or if he refused to step down after defeat. In that wargaming exercise, John Podesta treated Black Lives Matter protesters as assets in a battle against Trump, using them to apply pressure and force on Trump and forcing him to step down. Still today, we are facing a division within the deep state and a conflict between the capitalists, and this has opened up a space for protest. We shouldn't let ourselves be treated as puppets, but we should absolutely take the opportunity to protest, to take this opportunity that we've been given. We should also be more daring and more humble than we presently are. We should accept that the protests will not determine the outcome of the conflict in Gaza, not even indirectly. We should understand that, like the Palestinians, we ourselves are stuck within a political machine that severely limits our ability to organize and severely restricts our movements and political ambitions. But we should also recognize that, unlike the Palestinians, we are, for the most part, living under a regime that prefers to use soft power. We speak out, we aren't likely to disappear in the night, but we might face cancellation. I've been asked if the horizons of possibility for the left today are greater than they were 10 years ago. The answer to that question is that really up to us. If we can understand that the point of protest is not to win the demands written for us by one section of the Democratic Party against another section of the Democratic Party, the point is not to attempt to set new rules and regulations, but is instead simply to insist that the Constitution protects our right to protest, and that what is called disinformation is, in fact, legally protected political speech. If we use this moment of contradiction to reevaluate ourselves and our own ambitions, then perhaps we could have more possible avenues for struggle than we had 10 years ago during the Obama administration. Back then, I was studying Marx's Capital, and I was trying to discover what underlying dynamic was determining social reality. Back then, I wondered what it meant that the economy was doomed to go into crisis on a relatively regular schedule. Today, I'm able to look back and see what the political consequences of that economic crisis have been. I can see now how the administrative state handles economic crises, not just on the level of finance, but politically as well. I understand that managing dissent is as key to the reproduction of capital as managing hedge funds or trade relations. So today we potentially have more options available than we did 10 years ago, but only if we allow ourselves to grasp the truth of this political moment fully. That truth isn't an easy one to take in. It requires rethinking a lot of received opinions and might even challenge our identities as leftists. After all, isn't all talk of the deep state, aren't all critiques of the administrative state and Democrats right-wing in character? Well, no. Our task today is to understand just why these critiques, just why a deep break from the institution of the left that can be traced back to the Democratic Party and the deep state are necessary. So that's my presentation.
So now we're going into the 3 minutes of clarification. Do you have anything to add? Or would you prefer someone else go first?
Someone else go first.
All right. I see you taking notes.
I can't say that. There's a lot of direction, stray words that I wrote down. I mean, I'll highlight something, maybe, I'll get at a couple things, and I think it'll be good to open it up, and I appreciate everyone's sort of presentations in this discussion. I think one of the dynamics in terms of some of what I talked about was, sort of history of, I've often presented labor history, why we've ended up in this place in the union movement or in left politics, because I sort of foreground repression. Repression has been an important piece. Multiple Red Scares going back to the 1880s, the 1920s, the 1950s have had a significant role in shaping our outcomes. But I think that there's this task ahead for us too, is again, with the sort of theme of having an organizational apparatus to protect us. Part of it is, how do you acknowledge the fact that we are going to face repression? I can think of even in the channels of sort of permissible action, even in a labor setting where you're engaging in a legal strike action, you are not going out of bounds in any way, that the instrument of repression is always near. And I think on the left, and I'm sympathetic to this, that we often say that, we couldn't do a lot about the extent of repression that was faced. I mean, some of the things that happened in 1920s Red Scare, people being deported, labor unionists being deported, and we obviously know about purges from unions and things like that, organizations that really were purged out of existence. And I think it's just, I would just sort of call on folks to think about that dynamic of, yes, there's been this severe history of repression, which has shaped our outcomes as a left, and has contributed to disparate sort of tendencies. And at the same time, how do we build something? How do we protect ourselves, especially given some of the street level mobilizations that we are potentially facing? How do we, as working people, as socialists protect ourselves the way that socialists in the past have had to protect themselves in terms of the types of the forms of violence that they may face, whether it was from the state or whether it was from right-wing forces. So that was something I wanted to mention. I guess on the question of mutual aid, if you could speak to that a little bit more. I mean, one of the challenges that comes up, and I think that what you highlighted is really important in terms of, there was already something in place that was beneficial at the moment of crisis, and that there's already ways, and I've heard about instances of anarchists and other sort of, people on the left who've been at the forefront of distributing aid in the context of like a hurricane or, some other natural disaster. And I want to think about, well, how do you see mutual aid kind of connecting with how the Black Panthers viewed it, where they were thinking about, well, mutual aid is, they had this free breakfast program, but there was a politicizing component to that. I think you could talk about the ways in which mutual aid can help to politicize, or do you see it sometimes veering toward just service delivery, and sort of how you balance some of those considerations? So just a couple questions on it. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I can take it from there. So I feel like this question about mutual aid plays into this broader theme we're seeing about co-optation, right? And how do we not just end up aligning ourselves with the neoliberal status quo? Because there is a critique, in a sense, of those mutual aid organizations sort of filling the gap on behalf of the state, right? That we didn't have to deal with how unprepared the systems that are in power were for this crisis, because we had anarchists to fill the gap, and maybe in some ways that was politically disadvantageous, right? The things I see with respect to specifically the beginning of the pandemic and that type of distribution was that everyone ended up having a reference point for what mutual aid is, right? And also a lot of people established these temporary mutual aid networks that were between people of relatively equal social power. And I think that helped conceptualize a lot, right? I heard the words mutual aid on cable TV that year. I think it went from being sort of a niche anarchist concept to something that sort of everyone understood was useful. Did that make it depoliticized? I don't know, because I do think sometimes mutual aid groups end up becoming charities. I think the important thing for mutual aid is for it to, first of all, keep resources out of the hands of the capitalist, right? So if you can repair your friend's car instead of them taking it to a repair shop that's owned by a capitalist off somewhere else, and then a portion of that money, instead of going to people doing the work, is just going into that hoard of capital, like that is valuable. And the more you can scale it up, the more valuable that becomes. And I think also it is about positioning yourself in opposition to the state, not taking state money and resources and things like that. Yeah.
Thanks. Could I pick one to these? So one of the things that happened in Portland was the mutual aid movements didn't just show up out of nowhere when COVID-19 started. And some of them had been already doing harm reduction and stuff and that kind of thing. But some of them had been like street mimics and had been very involved in the organizing, like to counteract the fascists who were coming into town. And the mutual aid efforts, like there was the mutual aid efforts built off of that infrastructure that was already there around sort of anti-fascism. And then when the George Floyd, and then pivoted apart again when the uprising happened and started doing that, like, so Rose Medics which long-standing street medic group, started a production line to produce hand sanitizer, thousands of bottles of hand sanitizer, gave it away for free related to the pandemic. They moved immediately to chemical wipes to like remove pepper spray or tear gas, using the infrastructure that they had just created to make hand sanitizer. And so there was this, I don't think that there was actually a tension between like, well, are we destroying capitalism or are we, keeping people alive? It was like, and there wasn't a trade-off even of like, well, we'll move things toward this. It was the one built on the other and then built back on the second step. So the whole thing escalated because those things were working together.
Can I jump in just quickly, or do you want to move on to? Yeah, and I appreciate the response. It's super helpful to sort of highlight a few things that I think you all are familiar with and I think are helpful to the discussion. I was thinking, I was sort of seeing the dynamic play out in the union context where, there's an expectation that, and I think that it is important, if you look at the history of unions, there have been union auxiliaries that take care of all kinds of needs that come up in the context of a strike, and that there's this whole social fabric, a social support network that's there at a key moment to support working people. And that's sort of, there's a long history of that, and the unions have had that, to sort of fall back on, but that's dissipated to some degree. So every strike or every potential strike that I can think of locally, in Eugene, we were all scrambling to think about that. Like, what were the community connections? What were the institutions that could support that kind of action? And then, especially during the pandemic, we have a lot of members, union members who are looking to the union to do direct sort of service delivery, in a sense. Like, it could be food, it could be money. And there was a concern that came in there about like the tendency to fall into what we call a service model of unionism, where we are, you sort of make the union as a delivery mechanism for, the redistribution of dues payments, as opposed to something that you're actually actively part of. And I think you can work around that. You can talk around, you're part of this, you're not just receiving this thing, and that's not your only role as a union member. But it was a little bit of a tendency that I certainly noticed where people, and I think, there's something to be cautious about because of how much time and energy that it can take up, that it becomes the emphasis within the organization, like a union, which really has to focus on the organizing aspect and the demands aspect and how you actually have leverage in a situation. And I could see a scenario sometimes where that tension played out about where are we spending our time, and the service model unionism kind of coming to the fore. So that was kind of what's amplifying. I think you all spoke to some other examples, I think, that really get at some really interesting things that people have been doing on the ground, especially in Portland and here, I guess, too. Do you have anything to add, Doug?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One would be about the political impact of Black Lives Matter. I recall at the time I wasn't directly involved in organizing protests in the streets, but my kids were. And I would talk to them pretty often about what was going on. And the way they understood the protests was in this way. They thought there were two calls. There was the call to abolish the police, and there was the call to defund the police. The abolish the police call had a kind of 68 quality to it, but, like demand the impossible kind of quality to it. Like it wasn't thought through. They didn't have a plan for how society would function without the police at all. But it usually, the people who would make that call thought of themselves as communists and wanted to overturn not just the police, didn't just want to get rid of the police. They wanted to get rid of capitalism. And they're young, and so they were grabbing onto that slogan, and they were going to see where it led them. The defund the police call, they saw that as coming from Democratic Party representatives on college campuses, for the most part, taking the abolish the police slogan and transforming it into something the Democrats could work with. What I noticed at the time was that the Black Lives Matter protests, which had the full endorsement of, most of the administrative state and the Democratic Party, for me, the big sign of that was when some medical establishment, American, like an AMA or someone, put together a letter saying, "Oh, racism is a bigger health risk than COVID," and like thousands of doctors signed it, indicating that they, as medical doctors, could do politics for us as experts. Anyway, I think it's important to remember that Black Lives Matter in that moment was as much about the upcoming election and trying to discredit Trump. There was a risk to it because it could also be attached to the Democrats and be seen as, and Trump could be seen as like, a law and order thug who could restore order. So it was not clear how it was all going to work out in the ballot box, but there was a way it was being used by capitalist politics at the time. And I think it's just worth remembering that we are operating within the bounds of a society run by capitalist politics, and to be careful not to be used by those forces. And even though something may sound good and Randy, I think even though you're fighting in the street, that doesn't mean you're actually autonomous. So that's what I would add. I have something else to say too, maybe later if we have more time.
All right. Do we have any questions? All right.
Yeah. So I kind of have a multifaceted one that's kind of long, but I think everyone who was on the panel, I think all of you did a great job with the preface, but everyone presented a really different kind of vision, I would say. Randy, you talked about protest as a means of education, of communication, and kind of springing mutual aid or separate, a lot of multiple separate organizations outside that. Rajiv, you talked about combining with kind of a broader labor or union movement. Christian, you talked about the three-way fight and how you have to organize outside of neoliberal defensism. And of course, Douglas, you talked about how we have to recognize that we have a limited role in protests and avoiding that sort of popular front. So I guess this question goes out to everyone with those sort of visions in mind. Is implementing these just a matter of kind of doing this, spreading awareness, writing books, talking to people type of thing? Or are there material or organizational steps that you guys envision that need to happen? And if so, that there are those material or organizational steps, can that be done where we're at in the present state of the movement? Or is that a goal for kind of a larger proletariat or working class movement that's still being built? So I guess those are the two type of questions that I'm bringing up.
Anyone want to start with that?
I spoke a lot already. Shane,
Let's start first.
You reach the end.
Yeah, so can this happen at the point that we're at in the movement right now, or is this going to have to occur with kind of the expansion of the working class movement, maybe either more organization or more education, more awareness? So are we at that stage of taking these material steps, or is it still a matter of kind of spreading the readiness, spreading the awareness? Because obviously protests don't wait for anyone. They kind of just spontaneously erupt.
I want to take a quick stab at answering the question, and I want to do it somewhat ironically. I want to say, as a complete hypocrite, that one of the steps would be to turn away from the virtual world and meet people in person. But I actually do think that's true, despite my hypocrisy. Last week I was in New York and I met with Sean KB, who's a labor organizer and a tradesman. He's a carpenter, I think, and he also is a podcaster for Antifada, the Antifada podcast, and he's really interested in trying to rebuild civil society, like have civil society institutions be central to our efforts, rather than trying to start within the administrative state or start with some electoral strategy to meet people in person, make real world connections, and try to strengthen our social connections within everyday life. And I think that might be, a kind of good place to start. I have to take my own medicine though.
Two things. One is I feel like my position is a little obvious is that we need more organizing, not necessarily more education, but just like strong organizations. But I do really agree that social media has hurt the way we organize. I think a lot of people substitute social media for community organizing, for actually like meeting people and forming these kinds of organizations that we desperately need. I know at one point I got something that there was a boycott on that product, and I didn't know because it had only been called for on social media, which I don't use. And it's like, if it didn't come through any of the groups I'm in, and I'm in all the groups, like something went wrong, right? You're not organizing a boycott, you're screaming into the void. Yeah, and then similarly, I've talked to people in real life who say they have some sort of like qualm with the left or leftists, and when they give the opinion that they have a problem with, I have to ask, like, did you hear this from someone like organizing in your community, or did you hear this on twitter.com, right? And almost universally, they heard it on twitter.com. So I really do feel like we need to get face to face with people and figure out how we want to do things together in real community and not on the internet.
The only thing we need for revolution is for people to read more books. And start. Thank you for laughing at that. No, I think discourse is important. I think dialogue is important. I think ideas are important. The theory is important, but it doesn't mean anything if it's not also matched by organization. The organization is where those ideas have life. And we need all kinds of organizations right now. We need unions. We need radicals in unions organizing against their union leadership. We need affinity groups that are going to do nonviolent direct action. We need affinity groups that are going to fight fascists and cops. We need street medics. We need mutual aid networks. We need all of it. So, figure out what is of interest to you, where your skills lie, what's in your capacity, and what the fight is where you are, and then dig in.
From my I'll say a couple of things. So just being at the university, one of the things I've been at universities, university spaces for quite a while, different university spaces. One of the things in terms of the educational component, which I think is important, is we have a particular kind of mode of education, which obviously it's a corporate neoliberal institution subordinated to the interests of capital, about professional orientation and development, but you don't learn that you're a worker. And it's so important for the left to take popular political education up as a task. And what we see, there are limited spaces in universities to do that. We have a labor education research center at University of Oregon that was facing a 70% cut the first year that I got there. And there are limited avenues for this kind of popular political education that happens in our society in general, and ways that the university space connects with broader social life and working class life, especially. There are a lot of people who never inhabit this space, and many people who work here never get to sort of have discussions, engage with sort of political issues of the day, honestly. That can happen in unions, certainly. I think there's a need to reorient political education in the union setting, which is often subordinated to electoralism. We have committees of political education. What does that mean in a union? It means endorse X, Y, or Z Democratic politician or whoever else, as opposed to teaching union members about their class and about what United Electrical Workers calls us versus them unionism, and really capturing the tradition that we've had in the union movement about understanding who the boss is, and collaborate. We have a lot of this whole sort of labor management collaboration that was sort of popular in the union movement, not popular in the union movement, but popular in certain union settings, and really to push back against that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for an education that is tied to direct organizing tasks that connect to the material. So what can you do in the immediate? I would tell anybody in the union-centric view of this is anybody can just go and organize their workplace. Now, I have had grocery workers, I've had people working in pizza shops approach me to ask about how you organize in the workplace. And our task as unionists, and I think as socialists in general, is to support each and every one of those organizing drives, because it's not just about, it's about organizing that workplace, but it's about worker consciousness development. And I think those are dynamically, there's a dynamic interplay where there's a way in which you're sort of propagating a set of ideas and pointing, I saw this a lot with Starbucks workers. They were interested in labor history. They're interested in these struggles around class and about being part of this movement beyond, sort of in addition to the really important struggles that they're facing on the shop floor in relation to management. So I think it's a really interesting way that I think the sort of political education piece and the actual organizing pieces of, how do you start organizing? It's the easiest thing. You just literally start talking to your other coworkers. You start to come up with what common grievances are on the workplace. You start to connect, you start to map the workplace. You start to understand, what the dynamics are, what the major issues that workers are facing, and you start to organize around that. But it really is as simple as having a conversation with your coworker, which just seems like such a radical thing in a society with such alienation and with such separation, with such hyper individualism. Even talking to your coworker or something, you have to really tell someone, anybody can be an organizer. And I think it's the easiest way to be involved in political activism, to sort of start that process of going toward political action, and to connect with the broader politics that can lead toward a socialist vision. And I think, just to wrap up, I think what we see is, what is this sort of project of taking up organizing as a simple task that anybody can do, is that we've seen all these incredible new union drives. Eugene has been an incredible space for that, where we've seen so many Starbucks shops unionized. We've seen the student workers, like I mentioned, and we've seen so many of these, new drives that are starting in, like I study news workers. You see so many, I think, hundreds of successful union drives in news organizations. And what's important in that is you tie the sort of a key piece of this is that you have these many union drives. It's just driven by the most simple organizing task of talking to your coworkers and building up from that building a base from that level to actual institutional union support for that, which is what UAW is doing right now, which is an incredible sort of at this incredible moment where they won in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That happened while I was at this labor notes conference where Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, was there. Extremely exciting moment where things that were thought impossible, organizing in the South, they won this, and it won overwhelming. And now they have eyes on Alabama, and you start to see possibilities that didn't exist 10 years ago. And this was all because of, great credit goes to people on the left who took up this very difficult task of reorienting the UAW. And I think what that shows is how important institutional support by an organization like UAW is. If you look at that trajectory versus a much more difficult trajectory with Amazon, where you see they have not, there are different union tendencies that have emerged. It's been really difficult to consolidate gains. There isn't clear support in the same level as what UAW is doing. And so I really foreground that institutional support piece in terms of connecting it to the day-to-day organizing tasks that people can take up, so that you're doing the day-to-day organizing tasks, but you have something to support you, and you have people to orient around, you have existing unions to tap into for resources. That's sort of my union-centric response to that.
Does the UAW want to abolish capitalism?
It can. It can. The problem, I think, with the left is there's a tendency to want something that sounds, a lot of us love this vision about, let's take on, I say this in a lot of union spaces, that our key challenge is capitalism, that we have to think beyond this economic system. But I think what happens on the left, because of the delinking with labor, is that there's a tendency to kind of foreground slogans about, what we're against or what we need to overcome, whereas the sort of losing sight of the organizing tasks that are necessary to bring that thing to fruition. The only way to challenge capitalism is to have working class power, and we're so far from restoring it to where it was several decades ago. These are unions, and we have 10% union membership rate right now, public and private sector, a little bit below 10%. Public sector is higher if you just look at the public sector. And so, it's like, yes, is the UAW right now interested in, overcoming capitalism? There may be several people who are. There are a lot of socialists who are certainly in it. And there may be a lot of people who think that it's about working within the capitalist system to make gains for workers, which I think a lot of us should defend. We should defend workers seeking to make gains for themselves and also try to politicize them about what a different task would be or what a different project would look like. So I think at this moment, it's hard to say because it's new leadership, it's new dynamics emerging. There's a resurgent left within elements of the labor movement that's bringing the question of capitalism to the fore, but we are still far from realizing that as a central vision in the labor movement.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking that in sort of like, I have two thoughts on it. One is compared to something like you mentioned, the IWW having, Haggerty's Wheel, having this like strong idea of we are going to have like the economy structured through this union, versus the UAW would just not have something like that, right? It's very interested in like the medium term material gains. And then the other question is, do you see an opportunity for it to just get co-opted, right? Like the UAW to align itself with neoliberalism, and, weaken over time rather than turn more radical and towards more ambitious projects?
I think I don't want to take up too much space. I'm mindful of that. I'm happy to let you jump in. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, please. Thanks. Yeah.
I just want to add to that. I was in New York last week. I interviewed Sohrab Ahmari, who's the editor of Compact. He's someone who was working within the Republican Party, but going to labor conferences and wanting to convince people within the Republican Party to court labor. And we talked about how this is a moment where, as neoliberalism is breaking down on its own accord, and with efforts to onshore, the center of politics in general, both in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, are more open to changing the relations with labor and are also more interested in working with labor. What the flip side of that might be is that divisions between workers internationally will be more pronounced as onshoring takes place and as we try to return to something like a Fordist model, although I don't think it will be that exactly. But overall, it was worth noting, I think, and I'm with you in thinking that we absolutely have to defend the rights of workers and try to get people the best wages that they can get and lives that are more secure and less precarious. But it is also worth noting that a social conservative whose aim is to create harmonious relations between the capitalist class and workers is wanting to embrace labor precisely as a social conservative. And I'm just throwing it out there for us to kind of think about. And also, as the neoliberal order breaks down, it seems to me we are reaching this point where international tensions are arising, and that is tension between the international working class. That does, I think, point to a division within the working class internationally. So the war in Ukraine can be thought of in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways it can be thought of is as a symptom of the breakdown of the neoliberal order and a more nationalist international capitalist order taking hold. So I just wanted to put that out.
No, I really wanted to hear what you say.
Remind me again, what was the...
So just on one hand, like my critique of the UAW is there is no vision of a alternative society there, right? No. And then the other critique is feels very susceptible to liberalization.
Yeah, I mean, given any of these gains can be rolled back, and I don't know that it would be so much about co-optation versus, look, it's being a democratic organization, the reform slate that came in won on a slim majority. And it was a challenging thing to even get that. And I think there have been instances in reform situations where they've had to, I don't know if it was Teamsters UAW, where they had to change the voting the voting mechanism itself had to be reformed so that members could vote on their leadership. There's so much of that needs to happen in some of these larger federations. So I think this concern about, well, there's a rollback possibility within because there's different sets of leaders or different sort of slate that can come in because there are democratic elections within unions. There's the possibility of being subordinate. I mean, the biggest problem really with a lot of organized labor is subordination to the Democratic Party, an inability to articulate or sort of chart a different political trajectory because we're not there yet. I think there's possibilities for that to start to actually use there's actually a lot of leverage that unions can have. I would say that one interesting way that we saw that was with UAW, UAW strike. Because they withheld the endorsement from Biden, you had the first time that a president came to a picket line. That's not, for socialists, it's significant in a historical sense. I wouldn't say it's significant beyond that. And certainly I don't want to feed into the notion about Biden being the most pro-labor president. But I think that there is this relationship with party politics that has to be considered. And there have been efforts that even go back to the mid-90s about having an independent labor party. And that was something that mainstream unionists took up. And that dissipated, unfortunately, especially post 9/11. And that project is not something that comes up a lot because the sort of constraints of the two-party system. I think there are different ways that what we see, this is very incipient, it's very, it's at a stage where there's so much more. I think we're looking at a longer time horizon about what this will actually look like. You're looking to rack up more wins in terms of union drives across the board, whether it's UAW or Starbucks or certainly with Amazon. I think much more needs to happen on that front. And we need to see, I mean, you've seen so many different drives and so many successful union actions. And at the same time, union density has not really shot up. And we need to work on that piece, which I think very few groups, other than the UAW can really spearhead that in terms of the size of the workplaces that they're dealing with. So I think there are possibilities. There's sort of limitations baked in, just given internal dynamics, sort of relationship with the Democratic Party. And I mean, in terms of articulating a different vision, it's really just incumbent. I would hope that the folks who are on the left who are engaging in these spaces, that, if you look at what Sean Fain did, people can think about the president of UAW right now in whatever way, but it's the first time I've heard a concrete plan to move us toward something like a general strike by aligning the ending of contracts in 2028 May. And that's actually a tangible vision for how you could see mass worker action, maybe at a level that we haven't seen before. I mean, for us to even envision a general strike at a city level, we don't even have the organizing capacity to pull that off, though I've heard many calls for the last so many years. We should have a general strike. We should have a general strike. And this is the first time that I see a tangible way that we could get to something like that, which would require not just aligning the contracts, but politicizing around what do we want to see in terms of a vision for a worker-driven society. I think there are real possibilities, but I think all of us on the left who are in the labor movement are cautious and, cognizant of limitations just given how much is stacked against any of these reform movements. But I think there's a lot of momentum to work.
More comments on this question? All right, any questions? All right, Aisha. Go.
Okay. So I guess I just want to touch on the point that Doug brought up on sort of how all the current student movements and a lot of the current organizing and mutual aid and stuff is all a lot of it at least is sort of funded by the state and also is almost like tools of the state. And I know Chris Rahim brings up that a lot of the means are also sort of controlled by the Democratic Party and such. And I'm wondering, like, you talked a little bit about educational specialization and the idea of like within like the and stuff. And I'm wondering, like, maybe do any of you see like sort of a vision of like, with the movements that we currently have, could we use education as a means to break away from the state and this neoliberal people in power?
Could you hear that question, Doug?
I heard, was that aimed at me particularly, or I heard part, I think I heard most of it. Seemed like it was taking up what I said and aiming it to the other panelists, or did I get that wrong?
It's just for everyone, but yes, it's taking from what you said. Yes.
All right. Does anyone have anything? Do you have anything, Doug, then?
Well, I guess one thing I heard clearly was that you said something about how the state is funding mutual aid efforts. I'm not sure if that's true. In my presentation, I was talking about how they were, at least there was some evidence that Tablet published that they were funding the pro-Palestinian protests, and that they might have had some connection to Antifa. I don't know about anarchist mutual aid organizations being funded by the state. I kind of like mutual aid, but I do think that remaining on the kind of localist do-it-yourself level. I mean, look, I'm from the 90s. I remember zines and the do-it-yourself ethos and all that. So, but I do think that we need to think both locally and nationally and internationally, and if we can. But it looks like everybody has their hands up, or two people just. So go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I just want you to touch on when you say Antifa, what does that mean? Because in my mind, it's like anyone doing any anti-fascist work anywhere. So it would be like Rose City Antifa, it would be Corvallis Against Fascism, it would be like all of those groups. And they aren't, a collective entity that anyone could really fund. So I'd like you to just clarify how you're using that term.
Well, let me look and see, I'll go back to my source on this, the Tablet essay I read today. And I take it with a grain of salt. But let's see here. I'll look at the source. So it was, they were saying that Refuse Fascism, which was a Maoist organization, which with connections to different Antifa groups, was sponsored by the Alliance for Global Justice, which itself is funded by the Tides Foundation, which is a dark money operation working for the Democratic Party. That was the claim in Tablet. And I tended to look at that and say, well, I'm sure that's true. I mean, not every Antifa group is getting Tides Foundation money, but I bet I wouldn't be. I mean, they're not disreputable outlet in terms of fact checking. I would bet Refuse Fascism does get Alliance for Global Justice money. But the point that I was making in my presentation was to say that it's not so much that there's some secret conspiracy going on, but just that we are fully absorbed by the administrative state, and our imaginations are as well. That we are directed through, and politics operates through NGOs and financial capital and these organizations which are tied ultimately to the federal government, and not to politicians or parties so much as to the bureaucratic state. So that and we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that. And that's something that I've become more aware of in the last year and a half or so, as I have seen the First Amendment be what looks to me like it's being overturned through a network of NGOs and the Department of Homeland Security. So it's worth noting that what looks like the left, after the long march of the institutions, is actually often enough tied to the intelligence agencies, and not in the old-fashioned way of like, oh, they've infiltrated our group, but like they're funding our group, and it's not even that hidden. So anyway, that was my point.
So Christian, you had something?
Yeah, not conceding the small point about Antifa, but building on the bigger point. There's an aspect of counterinsurgency where the state tries to shape the conditions in which the insurgents operate in such a way that it picks winners and losers among its adversaries so that it faces the adversaries that it prefers. And overseas, this has been largely pursued through sort of development aid money, like human rights funding, that sort of thing. Domestically, it's been achieved through sort of the non-profitization of the left. And it means that, some people with very good intentions who do some very good work also find themselves in operating under some very tight constraints in terms of both practically what they can do and also the ideological aspects that might accompany it otherwise. So, so you don't get the Black Panther Stripes program. You get, Head Start, right? And the idea is really to allow for a certain amount of opposition, but opposition within some very tight bounds. And one way they enforce those bounds is by repressing anybody who moves outside of the bound. The other way that they can enforce those bounds is by cultivating the people who stay within the bounds, which also leads back to the co-optation question that you brought up before. And I think in the long arc, we've seen something very like this in the labor movement, starting with National Labor Relations Act, and then really tamping down with Taft-Hartley and other later, right? But the NLRA was passed not with the idea of protecting workers' rights. It doesn't say anything about that in the preamble. It says that it wants to ensure the stability of industry, right? Now, on the one hand, that means that there's sort of the unions who work within that framework are kind of always already co-opted, right? But on the other hand, like one of my critiques of the anarchist movement is that the anarchist syndicalists completely failed to account for this change in the state's position toward the labor movement, and largely tried to work out so much outside of the NLRA framework that they made themselves irrelevant. And they maintained this idea that the state was just the tool of the bosses and didn't recognize the big ground that had been ceded. So, yeah, the problem with co-optation, the reason it works is because when you're being co-opted, it feels like winning. And to the degree that they can make you feel like winning, the more they do that for the people who are being co-opted, the more it works.
No.
Can I quote you on that?
Sure. A quick response to the question about education. There's a really important piece of education in terms of education that happens while organizing. When people take organizing tasks up, when they start to talk to their coworkers, an understanding about work itself. And I think we've seen this really interesting time of, especially with the pandemic, there's a whole rethinking of work that happened. And then people started organizing around your conditions. People are talking to each other about what they're, especially people who are called essential workers, people who are forced into atrocious conditions, being forced to work. You had a lot of people, especially in healthcare facilities, totally understaffed. And then, it's a kind of learning that's different from, the sort of classroom-based learning or, even the popular education, so someone is presenting about something, but there's a learning that happens, an interactive learning that happens in the context of unionizing itself, or like taking up a union drive, where workers gain consciousness about the situation and their material conditions and how to respond to them. And that's a type of education, talking to one another, mapping a workplace, understanding time, one of the biggest people are like, well, the labor movement is only about wages. I would say essentially it's about time, about control over time. And I think that type of education comes through the day-to-day tasks of unionizing or organizing on the job. And so I just wanted to highlight that as a type of education we wouldn't typically think of that sort of relates to what can happen in a union job setting.
All right, speaking of time.
Oh.
Sounds like that, there's time for just one more question. So we have a question from Adoni, but is there a question from someone who isn't a Platypus member? All right.
I wasn't able to get here when you started, so you might have talked about this, but I somehow got the impression that there may be a question about the student uprising, the Gaza demonstrations that are, the campuses are coming alive. Did you talk about that? I somehow have the impression that there may be a viewpoint about those that isn't the obvious one, that of excitement that the flowering of this protest that's reminding me of Vietnam, that maybe it's not so simple as I think. I don't know what it was that somebody said that gave me that impression that you may have a different viewpoint about this.
I think that was Doug's.
Yeah.
That was, I think I was the one who kind of spoke about the pro-Palestinian protests. And what I was saying was that, I mean, first of all, maybe you're right that it is similar to the Vietnam protests. Although I would expect in this age that everything will go like twice as fast as it did back then. But my point about the pro-Palestinian protests was that we should understand that the way in which it's being framed is happening the way that it is because there is a split within the Democratic Party on the question of the Palestinian state. The Democratic Party consists of a kind of coalition of voting blocks, and the voting blocks have to be held together. And there's a real difference in opinion between some voting blocks who are more heavily identified with the Palestinians and other voting blocks which are maybe largely Jewish. I mean, I read this in the New York Times months ago, where there were Democratic Party members who were trying to like assuage both those people who identified with Palestinians and were also maybe attached to the Black Lives Matter movement, and then their Jewish constituents. But the point is that what's happening now is that there's an attempt to there really is a conflict, I think, but there's also an attempt to sort of placate everyone, and that isn't really working. The war on disinformation, which was started in 2017, is now bearing fruit and being aimed at the pro-Palestinian movement, which is emerging out of the Democratic Party to a large extent. So I said that the administrative state and the deep state is sort of working in contradiction to itself. And so we should be aware of that. Like, we should be aware that the most important question that's before us right now is not whether or not we're going to defund Israel. That's not on the table at the moment. There's no candidate that wants to do that. There's not a political force that can get that to happen in the short term. What is on the table is, are the people of the country going to retain their right to gather and protest or not?
Right.
And so that's what's being worked out in the universities. Go ahead, I guess.
Oh, I'm just going to note as a caveat that I think it's a mistake to view Jews as a bloc. There's also political disagreement there. They've been pretty vocal about those disagreements fairly recently. But
yeah,
longstanding, anti-Zionist factions within American Judaism.
That was how it was framed in the New York Times. I agree with you. I totally agree with you there. Yeah.
I think something that you said is like the most interesting thing to me this evening. What you said about you're surprised that it's not happening faster. I think it's because of what you said earlier. Two
people on the panel, I think it has to do with, because in the 60s, I think that I don't know how to say it. I think that the Twitter, what is the digital, that it was on a human scale, why it happened so fast in the 60s and why the numbers were so huge. And I'm so surprised at how slow it's been here nowadays, and how slow and comparatively speaking, really what's happening so far is very tiny. And when I saw Columbia and then 4 other schools, and I thought, what's happening in Berkeley? Because I was in Berkeley in the 60s, and I saw there were like 12 tents in front of Sprout. And it used to be like thousands of people. And apparently more tents are appearing, but I think it's because people are so not talking to each other in person like they were 60 years ago.
I think the term used, correct me if I'm wrong, is dissolution of civil society or co-option of civil society. Brandy, you got it.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a dynamic happening here, which is that we're all people, with degrees, a little entrenched in academic tradition that has ignored like body and emotion in the sort of like dualist way where we think we're rational beings. And we've all been dancing in a lot of these conversations around the fact that people have emotions. So like with the George Floyd killing, the tension from the pandemic did really build up to that. But I think a lot of it was, on the backdrop of being isolated and having all of these things occurring and that level of stress that then people were able to see his death in like excruciating detail over the course of 9 minutes, right? And I feel like what we're not talking about with Palestine is that people my age who were on like social media when it first came into existence. Like I was in middle school when Facebook was invented, I think. Sort of had our formative years spent watching terrible things happen to Palestinians, like seeing people's last moments and their living conditions and tracking the lives of these people that lived across the globe from us and like the real things that they were going through. So I just want to throw that out into the conversation, as I think, some of these things that we've borne witness to have just evoked really strong emotions in people, and I don't want to leave that out of the conversation.
So the question is, when we can see what's happening around the world now, it's so much more than we could 60 years ago. Why isn't protest happening faster and more, like exponential, than it was then, when all we could do was like read the newspaper and listen to the radio? Why is it that it's the opposite? It's so counterintuitive.
I mean, protest for what purpose? I mean, that's what I was trying to get at. I think that, like, it's unclear. I think there's ways that people's lives are, sort of been captured by the day-to-day realities of what they face. Not that that's different from how it was before, but there can be a number of things, from apathy to depoliticized campuses related to neoliberal corporate assault for many years. A lot of the institutions that took up fights that are not here anymore in terms of organizations that don't exist. So I think there's a range of things, but I think, there's just this question about, well, I think that we should ask the question, what did campus protests actually produce? I think there's this big question about what is the point of campus mobilization? What has been the centrality of the university in social struggle and the really profound limits of higher education-based sort of struggles? And so I think, that's where the sort of appeal to, well, how does this relate to people? I think there are claims or appeals that can be made in terms of how people relate to the fact that their money that's being taken from their pocket, taken from institutions that could support them are going to bomb and kill other people, Palestinians in this case. Sometimes the connection is not as clear. People are working multiple jobs. People are struggling on their own terms in this basis. And I think some of the spaces for mobilization have proven to be ineffective in many ways. In terms of what has campus mobilization amounted to over the course of time. I think that's a question on the table. It doesn't mean nothing, but I think that there are some limits to that.
Yeah, I don't even just mean campus. But yeah, I mean, Vietnam people were being drafted.
Sure.
So
I would just like to invite everyone to thank our panelists and as it is 7:45, invite us to
8.
We can push it out to 8, sure. All right. We can continue.
I want to speak a second to that question again, because I feel like you touched on the economic conditions being different, and I think that's really important. We've talked about like increased atomization, and I think that's really important. But another thing with like things being organized on social media, I didn't realize this was going to be my big gripe tonight, is that people don't see the same content, right? So if you were advertising things with like flyers and by reaching out like through different organizations that people were members of back in the day, I feel like that is going to reach a broader audience than calls on social media, because social media is so curated to the individual. So I think that's the other aspect.
I so agree.
Yeah, sorry, this is kind of a terribly formulated question. But one thing that I noticed off of a couple panelists, at least explicitly that I remember, Randy and Chris, is maybe not an outright rejection of crises. I'm sure you would both like claim to utilize crises as they come, but I did hear a couple of times saying that you don't wait for a crisis, you don't need a crisis, and that the politics and the tactics right now are, like, to me at least, my interpretation of what you're saying is legitimate and good and too extendable throughout like entire progress of a revolutionary struggle. I guess, how do you understand that general like what's like lacking between like now and like revolution, hopefully, if things are cool, in like these leftist organizations and groups? Is it like qualitative or like quantitative or both? Like, is it just like we need like more mutual aid groups, or is it like something about the mutual aid groups like that's not like why people aren't like joining them by the scores? Do people just need to like get better at convincing, or like is it something about the mutual aid groups? And if it's something like, if people just need to convince better, like talk to the people more. I think I heard Chris say you need to sell our vision or something like that. I remember the SDS had like that was also their, that was like one of the main points in one of their like the Port Huron statement. They were just like, we can't rely on crises or economic struggle anymore. We just need to like get out there and be really convincing. And I mean, 70 years have passed, so like obviously they weren't particularly convincing, I guess. So how do you understand that? Is like, I guess if you can respond to that in some capacity.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely that we need like a broader spectrum of specializations rather than, we have mutual aid groups, so we need more of them. So I was sort of talking about mutual aid because it's something that people have been doing continuously for decades. It's something that's easy to get involved in. It's something that when there's a crisis, everything's in place to do mutual aid already because it's so well organized. But there are so many other spaces where we are not well organized, where we need to be, right? So all of the other things that we would like to be different about society, we need people creating like pushes towards those or microcosms where we model those so that when the crisis relates to that thing, right, when the crisis is with policing, that you can actually go somewhere, right? So like if your bike gets stolen in Corvallis, right, where are you going to go? Half of stolen bikes get found by police eventually. The police have contacts with every like resell organization, right? They have this huge network and infrastructure. And I feel like for most people, you'd have to be an idiot not to just go to the cops and file a police report. There's no left-wing organization that's like, no, we have our own network. No, you can come to us instead, right? If I see someone like trying to like pry a window open while I'm walking down the street, who can I call? It's not the cops, right? Like those left-wing organizations are just not there. They're not in place.
That's true, and they need to be.
Yeah.
I agree that they need to be. Can I just say one quick thing? The Port Huron statement was not written 70 years ago, but 62 years ago. That's important to me because I'm 53. So if it had been written 70 years ago, I would be 63, which would suck worse than 53. Just want to point that out.
But I'm a little agnostic about the role of crisis. Like, well, I brought it up because I think we're not the crisis of COVID-19, the uprising of George Floyd. I think it needed everything else needed to be different enough for it to just suddenly become common sense for a large number of people that what they should do is like go and burn down police stations. It took a change not only in like people's thinking, but in like the organization of society, at least temporarily. Like things needed to be kind of like up in the air for that to take hold of what it did, I think. That said, I don't know, like does that mean that we're waiting for something else to break before like that opens up possibilities? Or, you know, could we be the crisis that we're looking for? I think it's worth trying. Now, in terms of why, like, what's lacking, like, really the answer is everything. Like, organization isn't, like, between here and revolution, there's no organization, there's no set of organizations, there's not even really, like, a set of movements that's capable of enacting a revolution right now. If there were, they would be doing it, right? Also, there's not, like, I don't even feel like our vision of what we're shooting for is ill-formed. Our theory of how we win it is pretty sketchy. Like there's there's this cartoon from Scientific American like 50 years ago that had these two scientists, and there's like all this math on one side of the board and all this math on the other side of the board, and in the middle, one of them had written, and then a miracle happens. And I feel like that's how our theories work, right? It's like, oh, we understand all this stuff about capitalism. We understand like some stuff about like what we want to win. And then a miracle connects these things. So, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. Start anywhere. Like,
Can the guy on the screen say one thing and add?
Sure, absolutely.
I would just want to, reaffirm what was just said and say, back in the 60s, which I was not around during those times, but I've read about them. There wasn't an economic crisis going on then. There wasn't, they weren't motivated by immiseration in the 60s. They were motivated by inequality in society, racial inequality, and by war. But they weren't motivated by the kind of crisis that we all still, I think, remember from 2008. And so that's worth noting. And when it comes to like why do we want to overcome capitalism? What is it that as socialists that we're aiming for? there's lots of different ways to think about it, but I think right now an easy way to think about it is that we are promised a kind of life which will make sense, where people can work together and make things better for everyone. George Bush used to talk about making the pie rise higher. And but if everyone's cooperating and working and pitching in, better results should occur. We should have more things. We should be more free. And we live in a society where when we all work together and cooperate and pitch in, wars break out and inequality rises, and it just seems like things get fractured, and it's not because of any particular bad actors. It's not because of some secret cabal of fascists or something intrinsic to our way of life that sets that in motion again and again. So being responsible for ourselves and trying to realize the promises of the society we're in is what I think motivates us to be socialists.
Yeah.
Where does I kind of heard the word vision. I think it was brought up maybe a few times, and maybe it was talked about and I somehow missed it. But how does that maybe play in a role of kind of moving forward to either activate people, to motivate them, to have them coalesce around an idea, maybe to stick with that idea to move forward? Because it seems I'm kind of hearing different things we want to do away with this system, we want to fight this, we want to do that. But what you kind of just bringing up, that when we work together, these things happen that are good, that make my life better, right? I don't want to work anymore, right? I don't want to just have my workplace organized. I want the work abolished. I'm sick with it. I want to be able to create. I want to be able to actually be free. So I'm wondering, I guess kind of my question, where vision kind of takes place in maybe motivating, what is the strategy or what is the tactic, and actually keep people involved and getting them interested, I would say. So I would say we can critique capitalism all day long, but the average person probably doesn't want to hear that. They want to hear how they're not going to have to work anymore and their basic needs are going to be met and they're going to be able to do what they want.
Who else want to answer that? Because I find when you talk to people about these things, right? I feel like capitalism has convinced a lot of us that the small things we do have control over are at risk of being lost to us when we start forming a collective society, right? That's not structured around capital. And I feel like people don't realize what you're saying, what capital has taken from them, right? So I feel like land is a really easy one, right? When you say you want to abolish property and land, people are like, no, I need to own a home, right? I need to own the place where I live, and you can't take that away from me. But they don't realize that capitalism has robbed them of the ability to decide what's done with all the land around them, right? It's robbed them of their ability to say, no, we're not going to log that forest. No, we're not going to build that housing development over that meadow. No, we're going to use the land in ways that are productive for the community. And so I think your thing about convincing people that you can have, agency over your life, that you can have liberation, is a big part of what needs to be done, right?
Anyone else?
It's you for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that it's as the right has become increasingly a conservative force, it's that much more important that the left be able to articulate a vision society we want. Because we can't just monopolize opposition anymore, right? In fact, I would say the far right recently has done a much better job of presenting themselves as the opposition to the neoliberal status quo than the radical left has. And they're usually pretty cagey about their vision of what the society looks like. They're just leaning on the not this part, the rejection. which means we can't just lean on the rejection. We need to both be like, yes, we're against this, and we're in favor of, all these other things, right? Like I feel like you summed up the soul of anarcho-socialism. So, yeah, we're in favor of that.
Mhm.
And I feel like we've done I just did a terrible job doing it right now, but I feel like we've done a terrible job of expressing the kinds of things we're for, like what the ideals of freedom and equality are, what they would look like in practice, what would be in it for us. Like, largely we just rely on sort of a moral rejection of the society as it exists, which I think is not as motivating as we sometimes should.
Can I piggyback off that? Because something I really wanted to talk about with your three-way fight is that the left, recently I find often allies itself with the existing social order because of a fear of the right? And so sometimes, like during the pandemic, the right was attacking big pharma, and the left, I feel like, decided to double down on the Democratic stance and be like, shut up, stop talking about big pharma, take your vaccine. And we did need people to take vaccines, but we lost the opportunity to get people to take vaccines and criticize big pharma because we were so positioned against the right-wing reaction to big pharma that we weren't willing to see the points that are valid, which are the points against, capital. So I feel like we do need to always remember to be the opposition as well. Yeah.
If Donald Trump had gotten reelected, I think leftists would have been much more critical about vaccines. After all, it was his vaccine that we were all taking, the one that the Trump administration had funded. And even Kamala Harris was doubtful that it would work up until she became vice president. So we should be aware of just how tied we are to Democratic Party propaganda. And that's a great example of it. The reaction to the pandemic was one thing when it was Trump. I mean, there was an embrace of the administrative state from the left overall, but it was it was dictated by party politics to a large degree as well.
And just some quick thing is, I think a vision that isn't grounded in the material is not socialist. And that's a classic Marxist point. That's that socialist politics is based on the material. And it's about understanding the relationship between the material and the ideological. And so I think we should have a vision, but it should be grounded in people's day-to-day realities. And we just have to, that's always been the go-to. That's what galvanizes people. There are things that are missing from people's lives. There are ways that people can talk about work. I mean, how much more control you could have over how your life looks. If you have more control on the job, if you have some mechanism to be able to control what your work hours look like, that means that's why was it 8 hours for work, 8 hours for leisure, and 8 hours for sleep? And because there was this, and with the ambition that it would mean a lot less work, they were talking about 20 hours of work 100 years ago. And look at where we are right now. I think in any facet of life, whether it's healthcare, education, I think there are needs that people are facing. There are failures of institutions. In Eugene, we just lost our only hospital closure because Peace Health decided to close. There are direct material needs there around healthcare, even if one has insurance. And so there's something organized around directly pertaining to someone's life. And I think, a vision comes out of that. A vision for what we can offer as a society. It's like, can you think about, well, we have this fight around healthcare, around immediate material needs. How does that connect to a vision for what universal healthcare would look like? I think each thing that we demand in an immediate sense connects to a broader demand about remaking the society. And I think that's when socialists and the left has been at its best, in being able to connect day-to-day material fights to a vision for remaking the society. And it, I think, goes kind of off the rails when it's unable to do that, or it's only about vision, or it's only about ideas, and we get caught in that sphere of discourse ideas, as opposed to how any of the things that we say relate to what people are experiencing.
Slime and bread.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, for sure.
So we said we were gonna extend it to 8.